Good morning, everyone. My name is Matt Baumhoff, and I am grateful for the opportunity Tom provided to share a bit of my journey this morning. My wife Sonia and I enjoy the 1111 community very much, and though our paths have taken us in different direction over the past few years, we both enjoy staying connected however we can. So my talk this morning is a bit autobiographical, something frowned upon in most of my preaching classes, but I am learning that insight is often more accessible through story than sermon, and I hope that proves true today. Sonia and I first crossed paths with the 1111 community at a very pivotal time in our lives, in the midst of a remodeling projects of sorts in our spirituality. The 2010s were delivered a few gut punches to our family. We struggled with ministry burnout, strained relationships, mental illness, cancer, death, and the accompanying spiritual disillusionment that goes with it. And it seems the pain of trauma, grief, and loss can be a catalyst that causes you to question embedded faith traditions. And we came to discover that it served us better to engage and wrestle with the difficult questions rather than ignore or just appease them with Bible verses and Christian platitudes. But asking the tough questions of deeply rooted faith is a painful process. Discovering cracks in systems of belief can be difficult, but as Mr. Cohen and the 1111 band so creatively expressed, it can also let the light in. I believe the process of faith and healthy spirituality requires one to do some critical thinking. And there's a saying, when the student is ready, the teacher will come. Sometimes the lessons are not what you expected. Some days reconstruction or deconstruction came like a swinging sledgehammer bursting through the walls and foundations of our faith. But they were walls and foundations, it seems, that could no longer bear weight in our spiritual house. And peering through the gaping holes in our once certain faith, Sonia and I sensed an invitation into a broader, more spacious and expansive spirituality. I was raised as a Christian, as was Sonia, and I'm still an enthusiastic follower of Jesus of Nazareth. And despite my struggles with the church, I had no real qualms with Jesus when I enrolled at Bright Divinity School at the ripe age of 48. But having experienced enough deconstruction in my faith for a while, I was eager to reconstruct, to rebuild, to move out of cynicism into a place of hope once again. And my first week at Bright Divinity was both exhilarating and uncomfortable. I was surrounded by more diversity than I had ever experienced. Diverse faiths, races, cultures, genders, and sexualities. Some outside the accepted norms of the previous spiritual communities that we had been a part of. In my first semester at Bright, one of these diverse outsiders noticed my discomfort. She smiled and said, "Welcome to the island of misfit toys." And a glimmer of light broke through for me. I recalled the sadness I felt watching that classic scene in Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer as a child. Maybe you remember the island where toys were banished because they were flawed in some way. There was the spotted elephant, the bird that sings, or swims, that swims, the water pistol that squirts jelly, and the cowboy who rides an ostrich. All of them rejected from the joy of belonging, the nurture of community, because who they were did not comply to accepted norms. I began to see the wisdom in my new friend's helpful metaphor. Eventually, I gained trust and friendships with these fellow strugglers. We exchanged stories, and that's when transformation really began in my heart. I discovered it is much harder to judge and exclude someone when you've heard their story. And many of the stories were heartbreaking. Cautionary tales of religious shame, rejection, and abandonment by often well-meaning faith communities. My evangelism professor, Dr. Katie Hayes, calls these rejected and refused children of God spiritual refugees. The ones whose hearts yearn for God, whose minds cling to memories of love shared in families and churches. They are the ones who have been pushed away, pulled away, torn away from the relationships and institutions that once gave them the life they imagined God wanted for them. I connected with this language. I considered myself a spiritual refugee of sorts, not having darkened the door of a traditional church in years. But this was another level. I had never been rejected and abandoned because of the color of my skin, my gender, or sexual preferences. With each new story I heard, I grew in compassion for the marginalized outsiders in our society. And my family was enriched as well. We had very lively dinner table conversations, propelling us away from debilitating structures of religious fear and constricting judgment. All of us growing together in the desire for justice and equality for all of humanity, all of God's so-called misfits made in God's image. Paul wrote to the Corinthians suggesting that there is a sadness that leads to salvation, and I experienced it. A deep sorrow in the discovery of my own complicit involvement in the hurtful holiness codes of exclusive religion. But these painful cracks shed new light on the Gospels that I thought I knew so well, revealing a more spacious Jesus who offered few binding restrictions. He welcomed all to his table, the full spectrum of humanity, from sinners caught in the act of adultery to the most pious religious Pharisees. Following Jesus means something different to me than it used to. Now I see discipleship as an invitation to transcend structures that confine, attachments that bind, and move toward a broader space, a growing ability to integrate and transcend constructed human divisions of race, culture, gender, and sexuality. And quite honestly, I felt like this new expansive journey with Jesus would be easier outside the institutional Church of America. So when I learned that my degree program at Bright required a year of field education, I was quick to let the director of the program, Dr. Stephen Sprinkle, know in no uncertain terms that I was not interested in an internship at any church. A nice nonprofit or agency would work just fine for me, thank you. But as the weeks went by and the deadline drew near, Dr. Sprinkle had only two options for me to consider. One, pastor of a Disciples of Christ church in Fort Worth, or two, pastor of a Disciples of Christ church in Woodson, Texas. Your choice, a rock or a hard place. So after some soul searching, I decided to choose the latter. And a few weeks later, laced up my Sunday shoes for the first time in years and charted a course for the 100-mile drive through the winding, snake-infested roads of West Texas. I arrived at a little white steepled church where my cynicism met the soft light of country kindness, care, and generosity. Honest folks whose chief concern is to love their neighbors well. And so I remained the pastor at First Christian Church in Woodson, Texas, twice as long as required. The healing and restoration I received there gave me hope in faith communities once more. Because if you would have told me 3 years ago that 3 Saturdays ago I would become ordained clergy in the Disciples of Christ denomination, I would have probably fallen off my chair laughing. But here I am, back in the institutional church, pastoring a local congregation in Fort Worth, River Oaks Christian Church. And I still have my struggles with Western Christianity and our many constructs that fail to imitate the compassion, mercy, and justice demonstrated by the author and finisher of our faith. The struggles that we have to make a difference like he did, to be kind like he was. But I am curious if a bit of a reformation is underway. I wonder if the trials of 2020, the tragedies of racial inequality and injustice, the devastating losses of COVID-19, the wildfires, hurricanes, and continual political strife are revealing cracks where new light can enter in. And maybe we are the ones to carry the light. One of my favorite light-shining theologians is Howard Thurman. He was the spiritual mentor of Dr. Martin Luther King and a favorite among the professors at Bright. I think I read his classic, Jesus and the Disinherited, in 4 different classes. Thurman was a mystic who was convinced there's an inner guide in each of us. We discover it when we listen for the sound of the genuine in ourselves. He believed we each have a true self waiting to be unleashed for good in the world. And the ramifications of not discovering this voice, not discovering this true self, of not listening to this inner voice, are grave. Thurman says, if you cannot hear it, you will all of your life spend your days on the ends of strings that someone else pulls. And I can relate to that. For those of you familiar with the Enneagram, I am a type 9. 9s are by nature self-forgetting. I'm one who easily forfeits my personal preferences, merging into the agendas of others like a chameleon on a coat of many colors, eager to serve the agendas of others through humble and loyal service. But my spiritual director suggests that sometimes what appears to be humble service could be something else in disguise. Perhaps it is the tragic decision, she says, to live in less than the fullness of your own grandeur. Choosing to live small, she says, is an affront to the Holy One who created you. Ouch. Can any of you relate to that, living small? I wonder how many of us live with self-limiting patterns that dim the vibrant inner colors just waiting to be expressed. But poet Denise Levertov offers hope. Like Thurman, she suggests that we all have a main thread running through our soul, a thread that gently, invisibly, silently pulls at us. And she says our thread is stronger than we think, and we hardly test its strength. I think the events of 2020 have tested our strength pretty good and proved that most of us are more resilient than we thought. And those of us with the habit of being on the ends of strings someone else is pulling are growing stronger. We have grown stronger. And we're ready to rise up into bold new expressions of our genuine self. So you might ask, where do we begin? Well, poet David White suggests we start right now by taking a small step we can call our own. He says, seek to become aware of where you are following someone else's heroics. Start with your own question, no matter how small, he says, and give up on other people's questions. And don't let others smother something simple. And that's my intention in the remaining 11 weeks of this crazy year known as 2020. I'm committed to doing the work, no matter how simple and small. Hanging on to my own thread, making room for listening and deep thinking, writing and dreaming of new ways to put faith to action in tangible ways. I think that is something that is available for all of us, and I hope you'll join me. Thanks so much for making space for me this morning. I hope you all have a great week.